Capitol Hill.
Congressman, President Trump has said he misspoke in that press conference with Vladimir Putin about his assessment of Russian meddling in the U.S. election. Are you satisfied?
Well, no, because the mistake was already made. I mean, the presentation at the press conference was more than just whether he said should or shouldn't. I mean, there was a lot of attendant explanation and description over his meeting with Vladimir Putin and his disgust or contempt over the investigation that I still think sends signals to the international community that what Russia may or may not have done is still something that the president questions. And I think that that's a terrible message to send to our allies who look for us to reinforce the provisions of NATO and more broadly the security of the Baltic states and those in Europe.
There are indications that the president's words are having an impact on public opinion here in the United States. A new poll suggests that only 32% of Republican voters actually believe the U.S. intelligence community's assessment that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. Does that put a Republican congressman like yourself in a difficult position? Are you at odds with your voters on this?
Well, if my voters think that it's an illegitimate investigation, that would put me at odds with them. But I would remind everyone that the investigation may not have anything to do with President Trump. It has to do with interference of Russia in the 2016 election. And to date, we've had plenty of indictments that deal with Russian nationals. My biggest concern here, though, is the takeaway from that press conference is that when Russia goes about interfering, we're going to have presidential elections in Bosnia next year. If you look at what happened in Montenegro with them joining NATO, you have a lot of countries out here that have political campaigns coming up with Russia seeking to interfere. And when those Russian proxy candidates say, no, Russia has nothing to do with this, they're going to be able to point to President Trump and say, not only are we not interfering, this nonsense about Russia interfering in the United States election is hogwash. Just look at what the president had to say.
Congressman Costello, I want to ask you about what the president said in an interview on Fox News, in which he seemed to call into question the usefulness or validity of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. He seemed to imply that perhaps it was ridiculous for Americans to have to go and fight for a small NATO member like Montenegro. Does that concern you?
You now have the President of the United States kind of calling into question, well, why should we have to support these small countries? It actually undermines the ability of NATO-seeking countries seeking entry into NATO of running a campaign to get sufficient number of votes to make application to NATO. So for all the president wishes to pat himself on the back on how much money he raised in the last week or whatever it is, I think that the comments related to Montenegro are more damaging than anything he did in terms of getting people's financial commitments. But when you have the leader of the free world call into question what the underpinning of what NATO is. Let's not forget, since 1949, there has been no major European war. And a big piece of that is NATO and what it stands for and our commitment to NATO.
And of course, the only time Article 5 has actually been invoked was in the defense of the United States after the attacks of 9/11. Congressman Costello, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.